courtroom was quiet, save for the muffled shuffle of papers and the distant hum of the air conditioning. Amelia Carter sat in the witness chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, heart pounding. She had spent months preparing for this day, the day she would finally stand up for herself in front of the judge who had humiliated her repeatedly during the company lawsuit she had filed against her former employer. But she had not prepared for smirk, the one that curled across Judge Harold Bain's lips the moment he glanced at her. "Ms. Carter, do you really think someone like you belongs in a courtroom?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Laughter rippled from a few of the spectators in the gallery. People who had clearly been encouraged by his bias. Amelia's jaw tightened. She kept her composure, reminding herself that every eye in the room was now on her. The injustice of it all, the blatant sexism, the casual authority wielded to belittle, simmered beneath her calm skin. She had been underestimated her entire life, told that her voice didn't matter, that her concerns weren't worth serious consideration. And now, here, under the very roof where justice was supposed to reign, she was facing the pinnacle of that prejudice. The judge leaned back in his chair, the gavel resting near his hand. "You're smiling nervously. Afraid I might call you a liar?" His eyes glinted with arrogance. "Don't worry, Miss Carter. I can always take matters into my own hands if needed." Amelia's pulse quickened, but not with fear. Every insult, every sneer, every subtle attempt to belittle her only strengthened her resolve. She had a plan, a carefully prepared revelation that would not only expose the judge's own hypocrisy, but also completely upend the power dynamic in the room. The attorneys on either side watched warily. Her own lawyer, Mark Ellis, nodded slightly, signaling for her to proceed with her deposition. Amelia inhaled slowly, keeping her gaze steady on the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice measured but firm, "I've reviewed all the documentation and testimonies, and I have something I'd like to submit into the court record." The judge raised an eyebrow, smirk widening, clearly underestimating what she was about to do. "Oh, this should be interesting. Do enlighten the court, Miss Carter." She reached into her folder and pulled out a sealed document. The court stenographer leaned in slightly, curiosity piqued. Amelia's hands were steady as she handed it to the bailiff, who passed it up to the bench. "This, Your Honor, contains records relevant to your conduct that directly contradict your statements in previous hearings." A ripple of confusion passed through the courtroom. Judge Bain glanced at the papers and at her, uncertainty creeping into his usually unshakable expression. Amelia continued, voice calm, commanding. "These documents show your involvement in an unethical financial scheme connected to one of the companies involved in this lawsuit. They are verified and time-stamped. Every word is factual and on record." A murmur rose from the gallery. The courtroom felt suddenly smaller, heavier, as if the very walls were holding their collective breath. The arrogance of the judge, once palpable, now seemed fragile. He fumbled for words, stammering, I don't, that's impossible." "Yes, Your Honor," Amelia said, holding his gaze. "It's on record, and it's verifiable." The courtroom's tension shifted instantly. Spectators leaned forward, some whispering to one another, others reaching for their phones. The attorney representing the opposing side looked astonished, while Judge Bain's own clerks exchanged nervous glances. Amelia remained calm, sitting tall, letting the moment breathe around her. "I believe this is relevant to my credibility as a witness," she said evenly, "and it's certainly relevant to court, given the position of authority you've abused." Mark Ellis rose beside her, reinforcing the gravity of the moment. "Your Honor," he said, voice low but sharp, "Ms. Carter's brought forward undeniable evidence that directly contradicts your impartiality. The court should take this into account before proceeding." Judge Bain's face had gone pale, the smirk evaporating entirely. His fingers fidgeted over the gavel, the weight of the exposure settling on him like a sudden storm. Every subtle sign of control he had exerted, the mocking tone, the sneers, the condescending posture, now worked against him. A clerk whispered something into his ear. He shifted in his seat, looking trapped. For the first time, the courtroom saw him not as a figure of absolute authority, but as a man caught in his own hypocrisy. The room vibrated with the tension of immediate reversal. Objection, someone shouted from the gallery, but it was ignored. The focus had shifted entirely to the dynamic of power. Amelia's evidence was airtight. She had carefully documented every relevant transaction, every recorded conversation, and now it lay in plain view. Judge Bain's jaw tightened, his previous confidence collapsing under the weight of public scrutiny. The stenographer typed rapidly, preserving every detail of the confrontation. Amelia's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the judge's panic, a perfect demonstration of moral and social reversal. The opposing counsel, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, nodded approvingly at Amelia. "Well done, Miss Carter. You handled that perfectly." Amelia didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her work spoke louder than any expression could. "Justice," she said softly, almost to herself, "isn't about who wields the gavel. It's about accountability. It's about truth." The courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs as Judge Bain's misconduct was officially noted in the record. His reputation, meticulously built over decades, now hung in uncertainty. Colleagues avoided eye contact. Spectators stared in awe at the courage of a woman who refused to be intimidated. Outside the courthouse, news crews began gathering, alerted by the spectacle inside. Social media buzzed within minutes, sharing clips and screenshots of the courtroom revelation. By nightfall, the story had gone viral, portraying Amelia not just as a victorious plaintiff, but as a symbol of courage and empowerment against systemic arrogance and sexism. Walking out into the afternoon sunlight, Amelia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The city's energy, the bustling streets of Manhattan, the distant hum of traffic, the aroma of coffee and street vendors, felt somehow celebratory. She was no longer just a woman seeking justice. She was a beacon of resilience, a reminder that those who wield authority without integrity will inevitably face consequences. Judge Bain, meanwhile, retreated to his chambers, face pale and expression hollow, grappled with the fallout of a career momentarily tarnished. He had underestimated Amelia's resolve, her preparation, and her unwavering belief that the truth would always surface. And just when the city seemed to return to its rhythm, whispers circulated. The court was reviewing additional cases overseen by Judge Bain, now under scrutiny. Amelia's victory was not just personal. It set the stage for accountability across the system. As she disappeared into the crowd, a reporter's voice called out, "Miss Carter, how does it feel to face down a judge?" Amelia paused, glanced over her shoulder, and said with quiet authority, "It feels like justice finally caught up with arrogance." And with that, she continued down the Manhattan sidewalk, folder in hand, calm, composed, and unshakable. Her story was one for the record, and a cautionary tale for anyone who ever thought their position of power made them untouchable. The ripple of her actions would echo far beyond this single courtroom, leaving a mark on the city, the legal system, and the lives of those who witnessed her courage. The truth, once spoken, could never be erased. The courtroom was crowded, buzzing with the quiet murmurs of lawyers, clerks, and spectators. Amelia Clark sat in the front row, her notebook open, pen poised, but her hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from the lingering anger she carried. She had returned to this courthouse because justice had a funny way of attracting those who thought themselves untouchable. And today, Judge Bain was presiding over a high-profile civil case that would expose his arrogance yet again. From the bench, Bain adjusted his robe, glancing over the crowded courtroom with a smug satisfaction that only years of unchecked authority could breed. He had no idea that the woman he once mocked, who had caught him red-handed in his hypocrisy, was about to step into his domain as more than just an observer. Amelia wasn't here as a plaintiff or a lawyer, but as a reporter for a legal journal that had been quietly following his misdeeds. Bain's voice cut through the room like a whip. "Let's proceed efficiently," he barked to the attorneys, though it was clear he saw this as an opportunity to demonstrate control. His eyes flicked toward Amelia, recognizing her from their last encounter, but he smirked anyway. Arrogance, after all, had a long shelf life in his world. Across the courtroom, the plaintiff, a young single mother named Karen, shuffled nervously in her seat. She had been dismissed, belittled, and openly insulted by the system for years. Bain had laughed at her filings, mocked her credibility, and questioned her competence in front of colleagues. But Karen had allies now, Amelia being one of them. Amelia had been carefully documenting every word, every gesture, every sneer. She had watched how Bain's ego protected his secrets, and now she held evidence that could topple him. The bailiff called the session to order. All rise. The heavy doors closed behind the last straggler, and the echo of footsteps reverberated through the marble courtroom. Amelia's heart beat steadily, each thump a silent countdown to the reckoning. She didn't need to speak. The tension in the air already did the talking. Bain began questioning Karen, but this time his usual techniques: condescending tone, sarcastic interjections, and subtle intimidation met resistance. Amelia could see it in the way Karen's hands didn't tremble as much, the way she held a pen ready to note every insult. She had been coached, prepared, and supported. Bain, sensing an unfamiliar stiffness, flicked his gaze toward Amelia again. "And who are you here with, Miss Clark?" he asked, thinking he could rattle her. But Amelia's calm, unyielding stare met his. No tremor, no hesitation, only observation. Minutes stretched into tense exchanges. Bain pressed harder, his arrogance flaring with impatience. "You think you can bring me down with your little notes and opinions?" he sneered, leaning forward on the bench. The room shifted uncomfortably, the spectators sensing the clash of wills, old authority versus emerging accountability. The clerk typed furiously, recording every word, unaware that they were witnessing history. Karen responded with measured, unwavering statements, her voice clear. Each rebuttal chipped away at Bain's authority. The subtle smile he wore when the session began had faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. Amelia knew that flicker well. It was a crack in his armor, and she was ready to widen it at a strategic moment. Amelia rose from her seat, her notebook now flipped to the pages documenting his past indiscretions. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady. "If I may, there are several rulings in public records from prior cases that indicate a pattern of misconduct." Bain froze, the courtroom suddenly charged with anticipation. Every eye turned toward Amelia, the room collectively holding its breath. She began to detail the incidents, carefully selecting each example that exposed his bias, his unfair rulings, and his habit of humiliating women in court. The murmurs grew louder, the air thicker. Bain's face reddened, a mixture of fury and disbelief. He opened his mouth, but Amelia continued, never breaking eye contact. Each word she spoke was a surgical strike. Truth wielded as power. By now, spectators and court staff alike were whispering, the whispers turning into audible reactions. Bain, usually the embodiment of control, now fumbled with papers, adjusting his robe, visibly shaken. Amelia didn't pause. She read excerpts from official transcripts, highlighting every insult, every dismissive comment he had made toward women, every public humiliation he had orchestrated. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Karen's courage swelled. The spectators' interest peaked. Bain's facade cracked further. For the first time in decades, he wasn't in command of the room. And when Amelia finally said, "Your actions have consequences, Judge Bain, and the public has the right to know," the silence that followed was deafening. The courtroom was now alive with anticipation. Amelia approached the judge's bench, holding her tablet, displaying documented evidence. The room leaned in collectively, sensing the imminent collapse of a man who had once been untouchable. Bain tried to assert control, but his usual authoritative cadence faltered. Each statement Amelia made chipped at the perception of his untouchable ego. With a calm, deliberate motion, Amelia displayed video clips and court transcripts on the courtroom monitor. "This is from a case in 2019, she announced. "You questioned Ms. Harper's competence publicly, mocked her filings, and demeaned her in front of colleagues. Your remarks here are consistent with multiple similar instances." The judge's jaw tightened. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The spectators reacted audibly. Gasps, whispers, and sudden shuffles filled the room. Bain's colleagues exchanged glances, the unspoken acknowledgement of what was happening spreading. Amelia continued, each fact carefully laid out, leaving no room for rebuttal. By the end, the narrative was clear. Judge Bain's pattern of sexism and abuse was undeniable, and the courtroom had become a stage for public accountability. Karen, emboldened, stood and addressed the judge. Your Honor, I've suffered humiliation and doubt because of your actions. Today, this pattern ends. I will no longer be silenced." Her voice was steady, authoritative. The courtroom nodded collectively in affirmation. Bain's attempt to defend himself was weak, faltering under the combined weight of documented evidence and public scrutiny. His once confident posture slumped. He tried a few protests, but Amelia's calm authority and meticulous preparation left him exposed. The humiliation was clear. The judge, who had built a career on power and intimidation, was now subject to the court of public opinion and scrutiny of his peers. The moral resolution came swiftly. The Judicial Review Board was alerted immediately, and Amelia's article on the case went viral, creating a ripple effect. Bain faced disciplinary action, public censure, and eventual removal from his cases involving vulnerable plaintiffs. The women he believed finally saw a measure of justice, and his authority crumbled under the weight of his actions. Outside the courthouse, Amelia walked with purpose. Karen, standing beside her, finally allowed herself a relieved smile. The city hummed with its usual energy, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred within the hallowed halls of justice. The moral of the story was clear. Unchecked arrogance can only last until truth finds its voice, and no power is absolute when challenged with integrity and courage. As Amelia turned a corner into the bustling Manhattan street, she glanced at her phone. Another tip had arrived, a case of injustice that needed investigation. She smiled faintly. The work was never truly done, but now she knew how to wield patience, evidence, and authority against those who believed themselves untouchable. And somewhere in the shadows of the next courtroom, another story waited to be told.